previously in Mark, Jesus had sent the 12 apostles off on a mission 2 by 2. We're picking up the story, the Gospel of Mark, in Mark chapter 6 at verse 30. But let's read chapter 6, verses 7 to 13 to get the context, because it's been a while since we were last together. It says, speaking of Jesus, calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Then they went out and preached that people should repent. And they drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil, and healed them. So, while they're off doing that, while they're off preaching and teaching on their own for the first time, that's the first time they'd been on their own doing this, Mark took his readers on a journey of our own. He took us into the palace of Herod Antipas, and we got to see behind the scenes what happened at the death of John the Baptist. And you can read that in verses 14 to 29 in Mark chapter 6. We won't review that today for time's sake. So now, after telling us what happened behind the scenes at the death of John the Baptist, in verse 30, Mark now returns to Jesus as the 12 apostles return from their assignment. And as we rejoin Mark's gospel at verse 30 of chapter 6, Mark is setting the scene for 2 more demonstrations of Jesus' authority and power. So first is going to be the miracle of the feeding of 5,000 people. And so we begin with, as your outline says, the setting. We begin with the setting. Let's read verse 30 of chapter 6. The apostles, remember now, the apostles would mean the 12 disciples. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. So the apostles, literally the sent ones, they've returned from their mission. Verse 31. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So now Jesus encourages them to get away from the crowds and get some rest. Let's pick it up in verse 32. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Now, that term in English, solitary place, it's the term used for wilderness in the Greek version of the Old Testament. So we understand what we're saying here. The Old Testament during Jesus' time had been translated into modern day Greek. It would be like, we translate the Hebrew, the Aramaic, into English because that's the language of our culture. Well, in the first century, Greek was the universal language, so they translated the Old Testament into the Greek language so the common man could read the Old Testament. And the Greek word for wilderness in the Old Testament is the word that was used here by Mark for solitary place. So why is this important? Well, Mark's repeated use of this term, he says it several times, at least 3 times, seems to point to a parallel in his mind, as your outline says, between the upcoming miracle and Israel's desert wanderings. So Mark seems to be making a link here by using the word wilderness between what's about to happen here, the upcoming miracle, and Israel's desert wanderings. How so? Well, Mark seems to be setting up, as scholars look at it, a picture of Jesus as the new Moses, feeding Israel in the wilderness with a new manna. Now remember, Moses led Israel, they were in the wilderness, and he gave them bread to eat, manna. We call it manna because it's the Hebrew word manna. Literally, they wake up in the morning and this bread substance would be on the ground, like dew, and they would say manna, because the word manna means, what is it? And that's why it became called, what is it? Which is what we used to, as kids, call a lot of our supper time at times. When there's leftovers, manna, what is it? But it was delicious, just like all my mom's cooking was delicious as well. But that's what they called it, manna. And so Moses gave them bread in the wilderness. And Jesus seems to be being set up here as the new Moses, bringing new manna. In fact, in John's gospel, John follows up the miracle we're about to read about with Jesus contrasting himself with Moses, teaching them that he is the true manna, the true bread that's come down from heaven. You can see that in John chapter 6, verses 25 to 33. We won't read it today. Now, let's pick it up again, verse 33. But many who saw them leaving recognized them. So he said, let's go away to a wilderness, solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So the implication here is that they didn't cross the lake. When he said, let's get away to a solitary place, the implication isn't that, so if this is, again, the Sea of Galilee, they didn't do this. The implication is they probably did this. They just went from this place, hopped in a boat maybe, and went over to another place on the northern part of the shore. So the people saw this, and they just ran around, and that's very easy to do around the Sea of Galilee. So, verse 34, let's keep reading. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, so they got there ahead of him. He said, oh boy. We did this to try to get away, but they landed and saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Now, I got thinking about this as I was reading this. How would you feel at this moment? You're one of the disciples. You've come back from this exhausting journey. Even Jesus acknowledges you're exhausted. So he says, let's get in the boat. Let's go to a solitary place. So they hop over and they land over here. They arrived. And there's a huge crowd waiting for them again. When I read this, I thought of an experience I had many years ago when I was in Indonesia. And I was there to do some teaching and visiting some mission global workers and so on that we were sponsoring and working with. And our host on the ground, we woke up early in the morning, like 5 a.m., and we got into a car, and we started driving around, and we would stop at all these different places, and we'd go into these little villages, and we would go into people's huts, and they would host us. And they would host us with the best food they could. Now, these were poor people. But they would give us their best, and we would have to sit, and we would eat everything they gave because it would be insulting to not eat what they had provided, and they had sacrificed for us to eat. And what we were doing is we were dropping off some gifts, financial resources. They didn't know we were going to do this, but we dropped off financial resources for each place to bless them. But our host, so we started doing this at 6 a.m. We did this all day. I mean, folks, we stopped at least 20 places. And we'd go through the same routine where they would feed you, and I think, I cannot eat another thing. I'm going to throw up, But you had to smile and be gracious, and it was wonderful. Well, it was about 9 o'clock at night then. We were supposed to be heading home, and then our host said, no, there's one more I'd like to take you to. And I remember sitting in the back seat being angry. Like, I don't want to go and love people. I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm sick to my stomach, I've eaten so much stuff. No, but I thought, no, I got to go. And so I did my best to smile, and we went through one more place, and I resented being there the whole time. I say all that because, as your outline says, instead of frustration, Jesus feels compassion for the crowds. I felt frustration. Jesus didn't. He comes to get away, and he arrives, and there's a huge crowd there. Instead of feeling frustration, the Bible says Jesus felt compassion for the crowds. And the word he used literally here for compassion literally means to be moved in your bowels. Think about that. That's what the word for compassion literally means. See, for us, the heart is seen as the home of love and affection. When you get a Valentine's card, it's a heart. I heart you, That's what we think. The heart is the center of affection and emotion. For the first century mind, it wasn't the heart, it was the bowels that were the home of affection, because that's where they felt their emotions. If you think about it, you don't feel it in your heart. You feel, oh, my stomach just did a flip or whatever. Or I'm nervous, I feel it in my stomach, not so much my heart. So it's your bowels that are moved or troubled, okay? So in the first century, I guess, they would say, I bowel you. You give them a little card with intestines on it or something. Now, I am so glad that my responses are not Jesus' responses. I'm so glad that agape love, the purest love imaginable, is Jesus' default position. His first response when he sees this crowd is not, oh, it's love, it's compassion. Again, read verse 34. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. So as your outline says, apparently their need for truth outweighed their need for food at that moment. The first thing he did wasn't feed them. He taught them first. Their need for truth outweighed their need for food. Now, the shepherd analogy was very common in the Old Testament, including as one of the roles of the Messiah. Verse 35 is where we are about to turn a corner in Mark's description of Jesus' next miracle. So we're moving from the setting to, as your outline says, the problem. Number 2, the problem. Let's read about the problem, verse 35 to 37. By this time it was late in the day, so he's been teaching. His disciples came to him. This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. That's what the disciple said. But Jesus answered, you give them something to eat. They said to him, oh, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? As your outline says, on the surface, the disciples appear compassionate and Jesus appears unreasonable. On the surface, the disciples appear compassionate and Jesus appears unreasonable. He says, the disciples come, these people are hungry. And they said, so Jesus, send them away into local towns and villages so they can all buy something to eat. And Jesus said, no, you give them something to eat. What? They said that would take half a year's wages. Notice they didn't say they didn't have the money, because they pooled resources. But they said, what are you saying here? Jesus appears unreasonable. What do you mean us feed them? We don't have any food? What are you talking about? Jesus is the master teacher. And this is yet another real life teaching moment. He's setting them up here. As your outline says, remember the context, folks. They have just returned, literally just returned from a supernaturally infused mission where they intentionally sought to depend upon God to supply their needs. Remember? Jesus said, go out here, don't take extra this, don't take extra that, just one shirt, nothing extra. You're just going to rely on the Father for all your supply. They've just come back from this. They're excited, telling him all the great stuff. The Father has supplied all of our needs, and Jesus is setting them up. Did you not learn? Have you already forgotten what just happened? So their response is likely more rhetorical than literal. They're saying, surely you're not saying we should go and buy all the food. That's what they're saying. Which brings us to the third step in this 4-step journey. We had the setting, and then we had the problem, and now we have number 3, the miracle. We have the miracle. Verse 38, Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? He asked them. Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So, as your outline says, Jesus tells them to take an inventory, ensuring they will always remember what they started with. Tells them to take an inventory, ensuring that they always remember what they started with. My wife and I just celebrated our 33rd anniversary yesterday, day before yesterday. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. So we were at a restaurant, and we were just sitting across from each other and talking about our past and talking about the last 3-4 decades together, and remembering where we started and all, the things that God had brought us through. Because it's good to take an inventory. It's good to remember where you've come from. It's good to remember how God has provided. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's ensuring they'll always remember what they started with. So he's saying, so take an inventory. What do we have to start with? Well, we got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Okay, verses 39 and 40. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. Sit down in groups on the green grass, he says. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. So this is actually unusual language. As your outline says, in the original language, Jesus orders them to recline in dining groups. That's literally what it says. He ordered them to recline in dining groups. So as your outline says, the image of a banquet is being implied by Mark's language here. Again, perhaps the messianic banquet, which the Jews were all waiting for, the great feast, the messianic banquet. And secondly, on your outline, Mark specifically mentions they reclined on the green grass. He's very specific about this. They reclined on the green grass, perhaps pointing to the image of Psalm 23. Again, we have the shepherd analogy, the sheep without a shepherd, so he commands them to recline like a big banquet on the green grass. Remember Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I will lack nothing. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. That's the picture that Mark is giving us here. Jesus, the shepherd of these people without a shepherd, commands them to lie down on the green grass so he can provide them. They'll lack nothing. Jesus is trying to communicate to the disciples, do you see what's happening here? I will provide for you. I am your provider. Keep reading verse 41. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he, that is Jesus, gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. So as your outline says, Jews did not bless the food, but instead thanked God as the provider of the food, is what they did. They didn't bless the food. They would thank God as the provider of the food. And this leads us to the 4th step, from the setting to the problem to the miracle, and now number 4, to the result. Let's read verses 42 to 44. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. So, as your outline says, everyone was fed and there were plenty of leftovers. Everyone was fed and there were plenty of leftovers. Now, the number 12 may be symbolic, it might not. 12 tribes, we don't know. They typically only counted men in that culture, so the actual number of people who were fed would be much larger, at least double that. Now, as your outline says, Mark does not mention any reaction from the crowd. Notice this, there's no crowd reaction here. It appears that only the disciples were aware of the miraculous source of this meal. The crowd was not aware. Only the disciples were aware that they didn't have the food. There's no crowd reaction in this story. This supernatural demonstration was more for the disciples, which sets up the context of the content of the next miracle, okay, when Jesus walks on the water. So, before the disciples can fill in the details to the crowd, you're not going to believe what just happened. Did you like that food? Well, guess where we got that food? We just had 5 loaves and 2 fish and Jesus multiplied. Before the disciples could do any of this, Jesus sends the disciples away. Keep reading. Read verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Okay? So, when we pull together Matthew and Mark's versions, it appears that this was the plan, because there's something unusual is about to happen here geographically when you sit down and look at it. So they started over here, somewhere over here. Here's Tiberias. And so it looks like they went somewhere like this. We don't know for sure. But Bethsaida, the Jordan River comes down here. It kind of breaks off a little bit. Bethsaida is about here. Not just a few hundred yards from the shore of Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus says to the disciples, all right, you hop in the boat and you go over to Bethsaida. Okay? And it appears when we piece it all together from other Gospels, Jesus must have made this arrangement with them. You go to Bethsaida and wait there for me. If I don't show up, then you hop in the boat and meet me at Gennesaret, which is somewhere along here. Gennesaret tomorrow. Okay? That appears to be the plan that they had been told. Okay? So the disciples were to pop over to Bethsaida and wait for Jesus there. If he didn't show up after a while, they were to meet him in Gennesaret, which explains why the disciples were in the middle of the lake in the middle of the night. If he told them to go to Bethsaida, what are they doing in the middle of the lake a few hours later? What's up with that? When you put together Matthew and Mark, it appears that's what the plan may have been. Let's reread verse 45. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Okay? Why was Jesus in such a hurry? What was the hurry here? John's gospel fills in the details that Mark omits. Okay? So let's go to John chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, and we get the rest of the story. It says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, so word starts to get around, and they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So Mark doesn't mention that. John says, so what happened was, he sends the disciples out, but word got out to the crowd what had happened. Jesus knew what this meant, so somehow he managed to, there's mountains all along here. Well, we wouldn't call them mountains really, but there's major hills along here. So he went up into those hills in the darkness and to escape from the crowd. Okay? Mark chooses to avoid this entire bunny trail, and he's just sticking to his main theme of Jesus demonstrating his authority and the disciples being slow on the uptake. So that's Mark's theme. So he omits this little detail because it's not important to what he's trying to emphasize with his gospel here. So let's again pick it up in verse 46 to 47. Let's picture the scene. So after leaving them, back in Mark now, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. Okay? Then it says, he saw, so if you can picture that, Jesus is up on the hill, and he sees them out on the lake at night, struggling or heading, it doesn't say they're struggling particularly, they're heading over towards Gennesaret by the looks of things. Let's read verse 48. He saw the disciples were straining, there you go, saw the disciples were straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. This is an unusual passage here, an unusual verse. It says on your outline, shortly before dawn, that's a translation of the literal phrase in the original language, the fourth watch. So what's translated in English, shortly before dawn, literally in Greek says, the fourth watch. And you say, well, if it says the fourth watch, why did the English translation say shortly before dawn? It's a translator's way of communicating, again, what's trying to be communicated in the literal language here. The fourth watch was the Roman reckoning of time. The first watch was 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Second watch was 9 p.m. to midnight. The third watch was midnight to 3 a.m. And the fourth watch was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Okay? So literally it said the fourth watch, which was shortly before dawn. So that's what the translators have done here. So as your outline says, this took place sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. That's what your outline says. It was a Roman reckoning of time, the fourth watch. This took place on the fourth watch sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., shortly before dawn. Now, as your outline says as well, walking on the lake, it says. So he's out walking on the lake. In other words, he's doing what only God can do. Jesus is doing what only God can do. The Bible says in Job 9:8, he alone, speaking of Jehovah, of God, Yahweh, he alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. So again, understand what Mark is communicating here. Shortly before dawn, he's out walking on the lake. Jesus is doing what only God can do. And then there's an odd observation at the end of verse 48. He was about to pass by them. What's up with that? What's going on here? He's about to pass by. That word about literally is the Greek word ethelo, which means to will, to wish, to desire, to intend. Okay? To will, wish, desire, or intend. So he willed to pass by them. He wished to pass by them. He desired, he intended. That's all the literal meaning of this word. So what's going on here? Scholars have offered various interpretations over the years. Some have said over the years, well, Jesus intends to overtake them and surprise them. So they're straining on the oars. They're out here in their boat. And they're straining on the oars, and Jesus is walking out, and he intends to walk by them. is what it literally says, if you take it literally. And so they say, okay, what Mark is saying is that Jesus intends to overtake them and surprise them by meeting them on the other side. So Jesus intended to do this, to walk by them and to surprise them on the other side and go, surprise, I beat you here. How'd you do this, Jesus? But that seems odd to allow himself to be seen by them if that's what he wants to do. That's not a really good explanation. Others said, well, Jesus planned to pass by them, but he stops when he sees them in distress. Problem with that is he already saw them in distress before he went out on the water. He saw them from the shore that they were straining against. So that really doesn't make sense. Others said, well, this phrase is from the perspective of the disciples. As far as they could tell, they thought that he intended to pass by them. So this is from their perspective, but that's not what he actually intended. Well, interesting, but that's not what the passage says. The most likely interpretation, and the one increasingly adopted by scholars, is the view that Mark is making a profound observation here. This is Mark building the case for the divinity of Jesus, for Jesus being God in flesh. It says he was about to pass by him. That phrase, about to pass by them, is an intentional echo of the language used in the Old Testament when God appears to men. This is the terminology used in the Old Testament when God appears to men. Exodus 33, verse 18 to 23. Which is in the glory of God and as appears to Moses. Says, Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. And I will proclaim my name, the name in your presence. The name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, compassion on whom I'll have compassion. But you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. Then the Lord said, there's a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I pass by. Then I'll remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. So again, it's the presence of God passing by them. 1 Kings, chapter 19. 1 Kings 19, verses 10 to 12. Let's go earlier. The Lord appears to Elijah here. Elijah says, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars. Elijah's whining here. And put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Again, this is the terminology when God appears to mankind. Mark wrote, Jesus was about to pass by them. So do you hear what Mark is trying to say here? As your outline says, Jesus was not ignoring them. That's not what he's saying. He's saying Jesus was revealing his glory to them. He wasn't ignoring them. He was revealing his glory to them. He's doing what only God can do. He's walking on the water. He's about to pass by them. He's like God did. The glory of God was about to be revealed to these people. Let's go back to Mark 6, verse 49. Or actually, verse 49 to the beginning of verse 50. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out. Because they all saw him and were terrified. So as your outline says, they didn't realize it was Jesus initially. They thought they were seeing a disembodied spirit. A disembodied spirit. They thought it was a ghost. So they don't think it's Jesus, okay? They weren't thinking this was Jesus' ghost. They didn't have any reason to believe Jesus was dead. They simply didn't recognize it as Jesus at first. They just thought they were seeing a ghost, okay? Keep reading in the second part of verse 50. Immediately, he, that is Jesus, spoke to them and said, take courage, it's I. See, they didn't realize it was him. Take courage, he says, it's I, it's me. Don't be afraid. And then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed. So as your outline says, Jesus reveals himself to them. He reveals himself to them. He climbs in the boat, he calms the wind, and he leaves them amazed. But look what Mark does with their amazement. Verse 52. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Your outline says, Mark links their amazement to having hearts that were hardened due to their failure to grasp the truth about the loaves. So that's why I said it was important that Jesus sends them off right away, right after this miracle of the loaves and the fishes. You feed them. What are we going to do? How are we going to feed them? No, Jesus is saying, don't you remember what just happened to you? How I've provided for you in all these ways? And Jesus is walking out on the water. They don't get it. They don't understand. And they're amazed because their hearts are hardened because of their failure to grasp about the loaves. What does he mean? As your outline says, Mark appears to be referring to their inability to see Jesus as one who was greater than Moses, someone who was greater than Moses, as the great shepherd, as one who protects and provides for his sheep. So they didn't see that he was greater than Moses, that he's the great shepherd, and as one who protects and provides for his sheep. So they're completely oblivious to this, is what Mark said. They still didn't quite get it. And then verses 53 to 56, Jesus' Galilean ministry is sort of summarized here. It says, when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, and then they anchored there. So then they finally made it over to here, and they anchored there. And as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. So as your outline says, they land on the western shore of Galilee and continue a fast pace of supernatural ministry. They land on the western shore, continue a fast pace of supernatural ministry. And look at that. I've finished nice and early so we can have a slow pace of questions. Any questions about what we've learned today? Yes, sir.
This event with Jesus walking on water, is it the same event documented in Matthew where Peter also?
Great question. No, this is a different instance where Peter steps out on the boat. That's a different instance than this one. So he's done this more than once. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Is it known who translated the Old Testament into Hebrew, and does it matter to us?
Is it known who translated the Old Testament into Hebrew?
Yes.
Well, it was originally written into Greek, yes. So it's called the Septuagint, which is that's often the Latin, which means that's the number 70 in Latin. Septuagint means the 70. So there were 70 scholars who formed a committee, and those 70 Hebrew scholars are the ones who translated it, and that's why it's called the Septuagint. And
Does it matter to us?
it does matter to us because the Septuagint is what the apostles and even Jesus would have been familiar with. And it's the Septuagint that we know Paul, for example, was often quoting from. When Paul and Peter quoted from the Old Testament, it would be often the Septuagint they quoted from because they were writing into the Greek language. They would quote from this Greek version.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Other questions? Yes, first here and then you, John.
Okay, well, just a thought about the Septuagint. We get to understand the definition of the Hebrew better because of the Greek words they used. So that's useful.
Yeah, it helps us in our... Well, actually, connect those dots for me. We understand the Hebrew words better because of the Greek words they use. Oh, yeah, so we're getting the nuance in that culture. Well said.
It narrows the semantic range of those words.
Yes.
Why did they choose that Greek word? Because they knew the Hebrew better than we
Yeah, that's a very good point. The good point that Calvin's making here, and that's why he works in our universities, is that Septuagint, by seeing the Greek word they chose to translate an ancient Hebrew word, gives us a good sense in the first century time what that Hebrew word meant, the nuance that it had. So that's a very good point.
So my question is this. In Gennesaret,
I didn't ask if you had a question.
no,
That's right.
is that a Gentile area again? Is there gonna
No, this is all the Hebrew side. So Gentile would be more southeast.
Gadarene side.
Gadarenes over here, yeah. Yeah, and this is the 10 cities and so on. John?
Yeah, again, this doesn't exactly fit with what we're talking about.
Before you ask this question then, does anyone have a question that does fit before we go to John's? And I'm not disrespecting you, John, just to stay on. Okay, go ahead, John. Yep. So, John, you're asking about Mark chapter 7, starting at verse 24. And that's going to be our topic in 2 weeks. So, you're going to have to come in 2 weeks, because it's a great question. The question you're asking is, what was Jesus doing? And a Gentile woman comes up and says, come, please help heal my daughter. And Jesus says, no, I have to go to the Jews first. And she says, and she begs. So Jesus seems to be rude. He calls her a dog, is the implication. And it looks like she gets the better of him in this back and forth. Looks like she outwits him in this conversation. It's a fascinating passage, and we're going to study that in 2 weeks. So if I tell you now, you won't come back. All right, folks, God bless you. Have a great day.